Examine the curriculum of any modern seminary, and you will find massive volumes dedicated to systematic theology. We treat this discipline as the highest form of spiritual intellectualism, the definitive method for studying God. The discipline takes its name from two Greek roots, Theos, meaning God, and Logos, meaning word or reason. Yet search the Greek New Testament, and the term does not exist. Scan the Hebrew text, and the result is the same. The total absence of this word is not a translation quirk. It points to a distinct historical reality. The framework we use today to systematically analyze the Creator does not originate in the biblical covenants. It was forged in the philosophical academies of ancient Greece. Tracing the specific intellectual history of this vocabulary reveals how adopting a pagan philosophical model replaced the biblical mandate for obedience with a system of abstract theory. To find the actual inception of the theological framework, we have to look to ancient Athens. The exact term, Theologia, was first coined by the Greek philosopher Plato in the 4th century BC. He introduced the vocabulary in his seminal dialogue, The Republic. Plato was not attempting to analyze divine revelation. He was evaluating the cultural myths of the Greek pantheon. His primary targets were the poets, like Homer, whose stories depicted the gods engaging in chaotic, contradictory, and deeply human behaviors. In this original context, Theologia served as a critical tool. It was a rational method for categorizing and sanitizing pagan mythology to make it philosophically useful for the state. The very first theology was an exercise in civic and philosophical categorization, completely disconnected from the concept of a covenantal God revealing himself to humanity. It was Plato's student, Aristotle, who took this new term and formalized it into a strict academic discipline. Aristotle divided human knowledge into 3 theoretical sciences: mathematics, physics, and at the absolute peak, metaphysics, which he labeled theologia. The bottom 2 pillars study physical things subject to change. Theology, by contrast, studies the highest, unchangeable, static reality. For Aristotle, the goal of theology was to deduce the substance and essence of the divine. This required analyzing God through purely intellectual, logical deduction, stripping away any physical or dynamic attributes. Under Aristotle, engaging with the divine transformed into a formalized system of abstract metaphysical speculation. If we look at the Hebrew textual tradition, we find a different epistemology for interacting with the divine. The biblical authors did not write treatises on divine essence. They recorded the word of the Lord, avoiding abstract speculative terminology entirely. When the text speaks about knowing God, it primarily uses the Hebrew word yada. Yada is inherently dynamic. It describes deep interpersonal intimacy, ranging from close friendship to the physical union of marriage. In the biblical framework, knowing God is identical to keeping His commandments. As the prophet Jeremiah wrote, executing justice for the poor and needy is exactly what it means to know the Lord. This matrix contrasts their origins. Greek theologia originates in philosophy to define God's nature. Hebrew yada originates in the covenant to obey His will. The Greek model requires systematic intellectual analysis, while the Hebrew model requires physically walking in His ways. Yada and theologia are not interchangeable terms for the same idea. They are opposing operational systems for interacting with reality. This presents a historical dilemma. How did an abstract Athenian framework become the operating system for Christian doctrine? The earliest major bridge was Hellenistic Judaism, specifically through the work of a 1st-century philosopher named Philo of Alexandria. Philo attempted to reconcile the Hebrew Torah with Platonic philosophy. To make the two compatible, he allegorized the text, stripping away its literal, physical commands to uncover hidden philosophical concepts. This method laid the groundwork for the 4th century. When the early church convened at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to codify its core doctrines, the framework had shifted. To resolve their doctrinal disputes, the Church Fathers did not rely on the relational language of the prophets or the apostles. They utilized specific Greek philosophical terms instead. Words like Ousia, meaning substance, and Hypostasis, meaning individual existence, became the strict anchors of Orthodox belief. Modern ecclesiastical historians note that the resulting creeds stand as monuments to the subtleties of Greek metaphysical reasoning rather than direct biblical exegesis. By the end of the 4th century, the requirement of endorsing correct philosophical definitions had officially superseded the biblical mandate of walking in Torah obedience. This intellectual merger reached its final form during the scholastic era of the Middle Ages. The primary architect of this synthesis was Thomas Aquinas, who fully integrated Aristotle's logic with Christian doctrine. Here, systematic theology as a modern discipline was born. It became the practice of organizing all biblical truth into strict Aristotelian categories like Christology and soteriology. This framework override produced cascading consequences. The Aristotelian logic of Theologia eclipsed a Hebrew concept of yada, separating intellectual theory from physical practice. Because Aristotle's framework categorized theology as a theoretical science, separate from physics and motion, it created a structural divide between what one believes and what one does. Physical obedience was no longer seen as the heart of knowing God. It was reclassified as a set of external, legal requirements, a concept now dismissed as legalism. Viewing God strictly through the Greek definition of timelessness and immutability meant that concrete biblical laws dealing with physical time and space, like the Sabbath or dietary instructions, were increasingly viewed as outdated or merely symbolic. The biblical concept of repentance, which physically means to turn back to a specific path, was replaced by localized procedural concepts like penance. The priority of the covenant, right action, or orthopraxy, had been traded for the priority of the academy, right belief, or orthodoxy. Today, the highest academic discipline of biblical study is built entirely on a non-biblical vocabulary. We have to ask ourselves, is our modern metaphysical framework deepening a covenant relationship with the living God, or has the intellectual study of the divine become a substitute for the physical requirement of walking in the way?